Today is the day. A little late, but still today. Intel Core i5-9400F versus AMD Ryzen 2600X. These were purchased with motherboard combos costing $230 and $235 respectively. So all intents and purposes, these are the same exact class of processors. We're going to go through the test systems, the assumptions, the testing environment, synthetics, gaming, and then we'll wrap it up. So first, we're going to take a look here, and we're going to look at the test setup. So they're identical. They're both running 2x8 gig kits of DDR4 memory. They're running EVGA GTX 1066 gig, that's GDDR5, a Corsair CX450M, the Antec DP301M case that I had featured earlier on in April, I believe, a SanDisk 1TB SSD, 500K external SSD for games. Same cooler, the Master Liquid Light 120. Do note that you don't see it here, but the Intel system would only hit 2400 megahertz on XMP, whereas AMD went to 3000 megahertz at DOCP respectively. And then these are the motherboards, both Mazrock. They're both pretty much in the same classification, so that also makes it a pretty fair comparison. Assumptions. So what we can assume. Motion blur was off whenever available. Both displays, particularly in this case the secondary, were running at 1080p. The desktop resolution matched the testing scenario. The GPU used precision boost only, boosting just under 2 gigahertz at 1965, and the core ran just over 8,000 megahertz. We have test results for stock and, in the case of AMD, overclocked. We have the memory set to the auto function. Again, we already covered that. The front fans are normalized at 100%, 1800 RPM, and the pump and CPU fan did scale both identically. Neither the CPU or graphics card exceeded 80 degrees Celsius, and synthetics did have a few programs just for monitoring open while we were running, whereas the games, which you'll see in a minute, had multiple. And then the testing. So high settings were used across the board. That gave a pretty good feel of not really bottlenecking the graphics card, but a good experience. There were a couple outliers, and we did rerun them to verify, and then we averaged them. Actually, in this case, there really weren't any, thankfully. The overclocked Ryzen chip hit 4.1 gigahertz. That was the fastest we can get in all cores. 1.44 volts on the core, 1.2 volts on the SoC. Programs running hardware monitor, MSI Afterburner, which was doing the frame rating as well as making sure the GPU was boosting, CPU-Z, and then Chrome with 4 tabs, one of which was running a video on loop, the Halo 3 10-hour, Linus Tech Tips, PCBudgetSolutions.com, and the WoW forums. Now, first and foremost, Cinebench. I don't really think this one surprises anybody too much. But what does surprise me is the single core on the i5. I expected a little bit of a higher speed. And the reason why is because at the same clock speed, Intel usually is around 5 to 8% faster. Considering they're both running about 4.1, 4.2 single core, I expected, the Intel chip to be somewhere around 30 to 40 higher. It wasn't. It was a dead heat. The reason why the all-core overclock here was a little bit higher than the precision boost was because there's a little bit of ramp-up time when it switches between cores, when it's doing single core, where it has to ramp up from like 2 something to 4.2, whereas having a solid 4.1 overclock did help, even in single core. And then for multi-core, not very much. The cooling was good, so we're only getting about 100 to 150 megahertz more over stock. But as you can see in this benchmark, if you're going for heavy workloads, probably not really going to go towards the i5. Now let's go over to Blender here. This was just the BMW run. These are minutes converted to decimals, so it is correct. I verified that. AMD walked away 35%. Just under 5.5 minutes, or just over 5.5 minutes. So it was around like 5 minutes and 37 seconds, I believe, versus around like 8 minutes and 16 seconds. It's sizable for Adobe, for example, would be a very similar scenario. The SMT really helps AMD in this scenario. But you guys do mostly gaming. Some of you do content creation, but gaming's really where it's at. So let's start with GTA 5. So I saw this coming. GTA 5 has always favored NVIDIA and Intel due to how their architecture is designed. And what was interesting was the 1% low was actually lower on Intel. So I would say these two both gave actually a smoother experience. A nice increase on the 1% load here, not much on the average. But this is something we're going to take a look at. I'm doing 1% lows in all my testing going forward. Rise of the Tomb Raider, Intel did squeak out a decent win across the board. Either the architecture design or the little bump in single thread performance. I lean more towards architectural differences. Intel did win by a decent amount, about 4%. On the 1% lows, a little bit more. Still relatively close, just a few frames, but definitely going to give us one to Intel. For Honor, it's pretty much a four-way tie, or three-way tie rather. Neither one gave really a different experience. What this tells me is there could be a little bit of a GPU bottleneck or just a kind of a limitation in general with both architectures. I'm not sure if lowering the settings or getting a much better graphics card would yield higher performance, but we may not get the separation For Honor. Ghost Recon Wildlands, also very close. Intel does squeak out the win, and I only say because the 1% lows were a little bit smoother, a little better, but the average frame rates were really, really, really close. Again, similar to For Honor, if we got a better graphics card or turn the settings down, would we see a little bit of a difference? I would say maybe, but again, I try to throw out the ifs and what people really are experiencing. You're not going to buy $100 $150 CPU and an RTX 2080. It doesn't make sense, right? You want to have a well-balanced system. The Division 2, AMD won. It's an AMD optimized game. This one didn't surprise me. What kind of did surprise me was the overclock helped a lot more here. Was a small win, but still a win for AMD. But this goes to how the architecture, design, and optimizations go with the CPU. We've always talked about this from a graphics card standpoint because previously to Ryzen, AMD was trash, and that nobody coded for AMD for that reason. That's the reason why part of the reason why FX did so poorly is it was a completely different design, really heavily multi-core. It was a bad design, but multi-core, and games as developers just didn't really even consider developing for it. AMD Ryzen being a lot more like Intel, it seems to be a little bit easier to design for, and there are games that are designing more one way than the other now on the CPU side. World of Warcraft, this is the first time I've done this in a while. And I used to use Fraps. Fraps doesn't work on WoW, unfortunately, which is why I use MSI Afterburner. This is where we didn't see any single-threaded performance in Cinebench, but there still is that single-threaded performance. And really two key takeaways is that if you're playing WoW and you're really pushing, you want to push the best frame rate you possibly can, Intel still is a better chip. Now that this chip is the same price as its competition that it competes with, it makes it a good option. But even the 1% lows were quite a bit higher. So when you compare like these two, for example, 14 FPS average and 15 FPS on the 1% low. So definitely a better experience. But the big takeaway here is that look at the frame rates. Like, this isn't rating, I get that, but this is going to scale to rating as well. So if you're getting 50, 60 FPS with Intel, you're not going to get 15 FPS less. You're going to get somewhere probably in the ballpark of like 8 or 9% FPS less. So, instead of saying getting 60, you might get 55 or 54. And then you look at, well, what other perks do the CPUs offer, because they're close enough in this scenario where there's no experience difference. Overall performance. This is kind of interesting. So for gaming, Intel does win, obviously. I'm not going to hide that one. It does perform better in gaming. There's a little bit of bottlenecking going on, but I don't think there's really enough to give different results. But where Intel fell apart with synthetics and heavy workloads, it was 20% behind. So what's interesting is these gaps. So when we look at gaming, so 94.94, 96.3, 99.00, right? Because it lost 1 or 2 games. These aren't big differences. 5% at 100 FPS is 5 FPS. But 20% at a 10-minute export time is 12 minutes versus, or 8 minutes, however you want to look at it. That's a big difference. So what we look at is the performance we get on total. So if you don't do heavy workloads, all you do is game, you're not streaming, then this is probably going to be a better value for you. If you don't need heavy workloads at all, then Intel's going to push a little bit more frames. And especially if you're doing a high refresh rate gaming and go the 1660 Ti or Vega 56 or even better, then you're going to see maybe a little bit better scaling here. But overall, I'm really happy with where we're at. And then obviously we have some chips coming down the pipeline here that are going to shake everything up. Conclusion time. Does Intel have competition or a competitive budget product? Yes, they do. I actually still have this system as of May. I'm actually still trying to sell it. And I was perfectly happy. The processor is between like $150 and $170. It performs really well. It boosts really well. It actually runs about 10 or 11 degrees cooler than the Ryzen chip. There's a reason for that. The Intel chip only goes to 65 watts. The Ryzen chip with XFR will go to like 115, 120. So, you know, you are more heat, more power. That's something definitely to consider. But it's a good product. If you're not doing heavy workloads, if you're really focused on gaming, I personally still would say go with Ryzen myself. But my point is if you say, Steve, I want to go with the 9400F, I'm going to say that's a good choice. Instead of saying it's a bad choice, it's a good choice. I just think that personally, there's not enough gains in one area to offset the potential for what else it brings to the table. That's why if somebody reaches out to me, if they're going to do anything other than straight gaming, I'm going to lean towards Ryzen myself. But as we talked about, there are drawbacks on Ryzen, and that is heat. It definitely runs hotter, and it's because it's trying to push the clock speed and voltage as far as it can go. And you know, it is pulling more power, right? So the other maybe thing to consider is with Intel, that B365 board is fantastic for it. No issues. The B450M board, I wouldn't feel comfortable with doing long-term 1.44 volt overclocks because the VRM is only a 3+3. And you're going to want to invest an additional $20 to $30 on a decent board with decent VRM, especially if you want to upgrade to Ryzen 3000 series, because those are going to be rumored to be pulling a lot more power, and you don't want to do that on a lower end B450M board. For stock, honestly, it's fine. I have no problems with it. But for overclocking, I probably would say long-term go with a different board, and then you're going to be spending more money. So that's it. That is the Ryzen 5 2600X versus the i5-9400F. If you want to buy anything featured in this video, it's in the description below. Like this video if you liked it, disliked it if you disliked, get subscribed, leave a comment. There's a giveaway going on to the end of May for some free fans that I use all the time. You know, go to that video, we'll talk about how you can win that. But as always, everybody, this is Steve from PC Budget Solutions, and I'll see you later on down the road.